UNLV Microcertificate Economics. Alright, so what are the arguments for putting on tariffs, even though economists agree, and we all believe, that restrictions on trade lower societal welfare. They make society worse off. Okay? There's some arguments for this, and we'll talk about these. I got the list here, and then we'll talk about them each individually. There's what's called the infant industry argument. There's the anti-dumping argument. There's the prevents outsourcing of jobs and the cheap foreign labor argument, and those two are basically the same argument. There's the environmental protection argument, and there's the exploitation argument. So, the infant industry argument. This argument in the United States was first championed by Alexander Hamilton. So that's how long this has been going on. Alexander Hamilton wanted the United States to become an industrial power. At the time, we were a big agricultural country. Thomas Jefferson thought the United States should stay an agricultural country. Alexander Hamilton didn't want that. He wanted the United States to grow and become an industrial power. So how do you do that? Well, he argued that we should stop imports of certain things. So when England wants to import cloth to us, we stop it. We don't let them import cloth to us. In doing so, we get the U.S. cloth industry to rise and grow and prosper. Okay? So you want to protect your infant industry. You start a clothing industry in the United States. How do you keep the British clothing manufacturers from killing it? You stop the British from importing cloth, and then U.S. consumers have to buy from the U.S. producers, and those industries will grow up. Okay? The question that economists always ask about this is, do they actually grow up? If you protect them their whole lives, when do you stop protecting them? When are they safe for you to stop protecting? Okay? And, the argument is always, if you see people raise kids and they're overprotective of their kids, and their kids end up weird and aren't ready to go out into the real world. Okay? So, infant industry argument, if we want to start up an industry in the United States, do we protect it? And, a lot of economists say no, but you look at what Japan and China, Taiwan, Korea, as they started growing industries, as, Korea starts growing their steel industry, as Japan starts growing, they protected themselves from imports, and those industries did grow up, and they did become competitive on the world scale. So maybe this works. At least under the right conditions. Maybe it works. Maybe it doesn't. Dumping. This is essentially what the European Union farmers did to the African farmers. If you sell stuff into the country below the cost of making it, you wipe out the local producers. Okay? Walmart's infamous to doing this. Walmart, and I'm using a non-international trade example, but don't worry about that. Walmart would go into little towns where they had, a lot of mom and pop businesses, and they would just sell everything really cheap until they wipe out all the mom and pop businesses, and they're the only store in town. So there's a little town called Ely here in Nevada. They had local sellers. In comes Walmart, wipes out. Walmart underprices every other seller in town. They wipe out all the mom and pop businesses. And then after they do that, Walmart goes, we're not making any money, and shut their store down. And you could not buy groceries within 50 miles of Ely. Okay? The same thing happens on a global scale. If you want to wipe out, and again, we're seeing Russia and Saudi Arabia try to do this to the U.S. oil industry right now. They're selling oil so cheaply that the U.S. oil producers can't compete, and many of them are going to have to go bankrupt, and then the U.S. will produce less oil. We'll need to buy more foreign oil when the price of oil goes back up. Okay? So we'll see how that works out. Jobs leave the United States. Clothing used to be made in the United States. Clothing is not hardly at all made in the United States anymore. And it's moved to other countries where labor is cheaper. So you can say, hey, we could put tariffs on imported clothes, and by putting tariffs on imported clothes, we could protect the U.S. clothing industry. Who suffers when you do that? Well, U.S. consumers do. Clothing is one of the things that's gone up the least in price over the last 40 years. In fact, clothing in the United States today is maybe 20% more expensive on average than it was 40 years ago. And that's not because of some brilliant move. It's because we don't make clothes in the United States anymore. We import them. And because we have cheap labor in other countries that make those clothes, right? If you can pay someone $2 or $3 or $4 an hour, or sometimes $2 or $3 or $4 a day to make clothes, those clothes are going to be way cheaper, and you're going to wipe out the domestic industry. So jobs are going to move. Okay? So maybe 1 million jobs have moved from the United States to China in the last 20 years. On the other hand, the other side of that, of course, is the consumer's benefit when they do that. Right? So these workers in other countries, their labor is cheap, they don't have benefits, they don't have unions, they don't have any protections. Socially, it might be a problem, but it's better for consumers. So we have these arguments, right? Are we doing people a favor by not outsourcing? We'll talk about that some more. I put Voltron here because it's always important whenever we have these discussions about we're losing jobs, whatever. For every job we've lost to another country, and we've lost a lot, right? There, all kinds of companies have moved their call centers to India because labor's cheap, phones, they have high technology, it's a well-educated population, they speak English, and you can save a lot of money by moving your call center from the United States to India. Okay? Lose jobs. It's good for American business. It's not good for the American workers who had those jobs, but it's good for American business. For every job that we've lost that way, we've lost 4 to robots. Automation is wiping out 4 times as many jobs every year as are leaving the United States to go to other countries. Okay? There's estimates that maybe 1/3 of all the jobs in the United States could go away in the next 20 years to automation. So if you're an economist, you're more scared about the effects of self-driving cars and self-driving trucks on the world than you are about jobs leaving to China. It's not that you're not thinking about jobs leaving the United States, but that's not the reason that most jobs are going away. Okay? You don't need to go to the front desk of a hotel to check in. You can check in online. Your phone can be programmed to be the door key, and you can actually open the door to your hotel room with your phone. You never have to go to the front desk of a hotel anymore. That means hotels have fewer need to hire front desk workers. Okay? Just saying. Environmental issues. The thing that President Obama, when he was running for president in 2008, said we need to negotiate NAFTA, and the 2 things were labor and environment. Many bad polluting businesses in the United States were moved across the river, right? So you have a factory in San Diego, or you have a factory somewhere in Texas on the border, right? You move that factory across the river, and now that factory is in Mexico. It doesn't face the same environmental rules that it faced when it was in the United States. It can pollute a lot more just by moving a couple miles to the other side of the border or the river. Okay? So if you've ever lived in San Diego, for example, they tell you not to go into the ocean south of Pacific Beach. And the reason is that all this pollution gets dumped into the river in Tijuana and flows into the ocean, and bacteria counts south of Pacific Beach are so high it's unhealthy. Surfers in the southern part of San Diego area, even in the hot summer, wear full body wetsuits, because if you don't, you'll get sores on you and stuff. It's really bad. Okay? So putting tariffs on, if countries don't have environmental rules, could be a way to help promote countries cleaning up. The United States has cleaned up the air and the water a lot over the last 40, 50 years. But we've done a lot of it by moving those things to other countries. So Mexico City has the most polluted air in the world. LA's air is a lot cleaner. Vegas's air is a lot cleaner. Mexico City's air, Beijing's air, much worse off. Okay, we've exported pollution. There used to be a rocket fuel factory in Henderson. That rocket fuel factory is now in India. Things that pollute, we didn't get rid of necessarily, we moved them. Okay? We could use trade to try to fix that problem on a global scale. And then there's these whole rich versus poor debates. We've talked about this, rich countries versus poor countries. Billions of people in the world don't have access to fresh water. They live on, $1, $2 a day. The bananas are the best example of this, and we've mentioned this before, and we'll probably mention it again. All of the banana plantations in Costa Rica are owned by U.S. companies. So when profits are made off of bananas that are grown in Costa Rica, those profits come to the United States. They don't stay in Costa Rica. Okay? What's the argument? Well, the banana companies say, look, they wouldn't have those banana plantations if it weren't for us. The U.S. companies invest the money, created the jobs. So those plantations are big and work really well, and they're profitable because of all this investment from U.S. companies. U.S. companies should get money back because of that. Okay? Other people say, no, you're really exploiting the Costa Ricans. You're not paying them very well. You're taking it, you're using their land. You're exploiting that country because they don't have any other choice, and you're taking advantage of them, and you're making more money than you would otherwise. And there's no right or wrong here, right? Or you may think there's a right or wrong, but for every person who thinks it's one way, the other person thinks it's the other way. What's the right answer? And it's not clear what the right answer is. But again, could Costa Rica do something to try to, could the U.S., there was a international battle over bananas getting imported into Europe, and it wasn't between Costa Rica and French Guiana. It was between the U.S. and France, because the banana plantations in the Caribbean that the United States doesn't own, France owns. And so it was French companies fighting American companies over bananas that are grown in these countries on the Caribbean. Okay? Again, life is complex. Life is not simple. All right. So what have we learned about trade wars? Well, consumers are always hurt by trade wars. Right? Every example we did, when we restrict trade, U.S. consumers are hurt. So whenever something happens and we restrict, it's the consumers that are hurt. Domestic producers, some of them can benefit and some of them can get hurt. And let me give you an example. So George W. Bush, when he was president, wanted to protect the U.S. steel industry, so he put on tariffs against Korean and Brazilian steel companies, okay, which is to the benefit of U.S. steel companies. And U.S. steel companies were all happy and smiling and happy. Who were the first people who called him complaining? Well, that answer is General Motors and Ford. Why? General Motors and Ford have to compete with Japanese and Korean and German car companies. Well, if Japanese and German and Korean car companies can buy their steel from Brazil and Korea, and U.S. car companies have to buy their steel from U.S. steel companies, U.S. cars are going to be more expensive than Japanese or Korean, and it's going to be to the advantage. So Bush had to take those tariffs off, and he had to take them off because while he was helping U.S. steel companies, he was hurting U.S. car companies and any other U.S. company that was using steel, Caterpillar and John Deere and all these other U.S. companies that need a lot of steel. He was hurting them while he was helping the steel industry. So the message again is these things are always complex. There's no simple, this will help us, this will hurt us, this will... What we want is free and fair trade. And it's a very difficult thing to obtain because one side can always gain at the expense of the other if it can cheat a little and the other side doesn't cheat back.